fact rather than fiction. Corporate directors and officers are discretionaries, not fiduciaries. Oh, quite a provocative title we have this time, don't we? Welcome to the BetterBots podcast series, the podcast for chairs, CEOs, non-executive directors, company secretaries, and their advisors. Every episode is filled with practical insights and learnings from those inside boardrooms. We discuss what really matters and highlight actionable steps you can take to enhance the performance of your board. This podcast focuses on what some would describe as the reality that corporate directors and officers are not fiduciaries. In fact, the liability standards that apply in the United States are, according to our guests in this podcast, far too lenient to be identified as fiduciary. This mischaracterization of corporate directors and officers as fiduciaries is an important misnomer, as it's detrimental to the rule of law, controverses reasonable investor expectations, and impairs, according to our guest, the integrity of the financial markets. Accordingly, the term fiduciary presents a false portrayal to him. A new and neutral term that conveys an accurate description should be adopted, and in his mind, it's discretionaries. Mark Steinberg is the Radford Professor of Law at Southern Methodist University, a Dedman School of Law. He has lectured or been appointed at other premier universities worldwide. Professor Steinberg was an attorney at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. He has been retained as an expert witness in several high-profile cases and is considered one of the most prolific authors in U.S. company law scholarship. He serves as editor-in-chief of the International Lawyer and the Security Regulatory Law Journal. He has also written a book on the subject that has won several big prizes already. Mark, thank you so much for contributing to the BetterBots podcast series.
Delighted to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Sabine.
Mark, let's jump straight in. You have some interesting thoughts, particularly around the wording of fiduciary duties. So why, in your view, is fiduciary no longer an appropriate term to describe the legal obligations of corporate directors and officers?
Of course, my analysis is mainly focused in the United States. The term fiduciary generally means that one acts with reasonable care and good faith and with loyalty to those whom the fiduciary duty is owed. How the law is developed in the United States, insofar as liability standards are concerned, under company law, these standards are no longer fiduciary, so that therefore to call directors and officers fiduciaries is a misnomer.
How would you describe it instead?
I've thought this over. I've been on this subject since really over 40 years now. My days at the Securities and Exchange Commission in the Enforcement Division, being in academia for over 4 decades, being an expert witness. I think that the law has evolved in such a way that corporate directors and officers today should be viewed as discretionaries rather than fiduciaries. And what I mean by discretionaries is that their legal obligations vary depending upon the facts and circumstances. At times, truly fiduciary duties do apply in particular situations, but more often the standards are not fiduciary in nature. They are far more lax. And therefore, a neutral term should be developed, which I view as calling these individuals discretionaries.
I mean, it's a thought that rattles pretty much on the foundations of what we were thinking about directors for a long, long time, doesn't it?
It certainly does. But I think when you look at the episodic situations that are occurring in the United States, when directors are held monetarily liable, simply the standards are not fiduciary related. For example, for breach of the duty of care, gross negligence must be shown. Gross negligence is basically an utter disregard. That's not a fiduciary situation. The business judgment rule in the U.S., where the plaintiff must again show gross negligence in order to rebut the presumption of the business judgment rule. In other contexts, one acting with gross negligence in the United States is subject to exemplatory or punitive damages. And then in the U.S., on top of that, the states have what are called exculpation statutes, which provide greater protection from liability with respect to directors and frequently with respect to officers as well, which I'll be happy to get into if you'd like.
I mean, I would be interested to understand more because we know we have a global audience here. How do you support your analysis? I mean, what's the foundation of your thinking there?
Oh, I'm happy to answer that. It's clear. When one thinks of the role of fiduciary, that means that the fiduciary acts with reasonable care, in good faith, and with loyalty to whom that duty is owed. That's a clear definition of fiduciary. It's set forth in Black's Law Dictionary. But for example, one example I just gave is what is the standard to hold a director monetarily liable for a breach of the duty of care? It's gross negligence. Gross negligence is basically such conduct as to constitute deliberate disregard or reckless indifference. That's clearly not a fiduciary standard. And then in the U.S., we have codified or by judicial interpretation the business judgment rule. The business judgment rule basically says that if directors engage in a deliberative decision that's made without a conflict of interest, that is made with adequate information before those individuals, then that decision is protected. But to rebut that, gross negligence is required. And as a vice chancellor of the Delaware Chancery Court said in an opinion a couple of years ago, that it is more difficult for a plaintiff to rebut the presumption of the business judgment rule than it is for a prosecutor to obtain a criminal conviction for criminal negligence. So that therefore it's easier for one to go to prison in the United States than it is for a plaintiff to rebut the business judgment rule in litigation, which requires gross negligence. And then on top of that, we have exculpation statutes, which, for example, Delaware, of course, is a mainstay where most large publicly held corporations incorporate. And with respect to Delaware's exculpation statute, which is the majority rule adopted in other states as well, that if there's not a duty of loyalty issue implicated, then intentional misconduct must be shown, so that even recklessness is not sufficient if monetary liability is concerned. And then I'm from Texas. Texas adopted a statute last summer that says in order for a director or officer to be held liable for money damages, what must be shown is a breach of fiduciary duty, as it is called under the statute, meaning the duty of care or the duty of loyalty. And then in addition, the plaintiff must show that such breach was committed by fraud, intentional misconduct, or a knowing violation of the law, or as an ultra vires act. Those simply are not fiduciary standards. So that therefore, to call these individuals fiduciaries today presents a false portrayal. And to me, that's unacceptable.
So why does all of this matter? You know, as long as the legal structures are really understood, why is this change of terminology so important to you?
Well, it should not only be important to me, it should be important to everyone who is concerned about the law being truthful. That is a foundational issue. I understand that argument, and that argument is that the term fiduciary to describe directors, that term has been around literally for centuries, both in the United States and outside of the United States. And so long as these individuals occupy these positions and people know what the legal standards are, what's the big deal about still calling them fiduciaries? Well, to me, it is a big deal. And the big deal is that the law should be truthful. And when a fiduciary is viewed as exercising reasonable care, exercising good faith, exercising loyalty, but is not held accountable when he or she does not act consistent with those principles, then the law is not being truthful, plain and simple. Secondly, that a principle should correspond to the characteristics to which it is identified. And of course, as I just said, the characteristics of a fiduciary are good faith, loyalty, reasonable care. And simply when you go to the liability standard in corporate law, they're not held to these standards. And then lastly, we have in the markets today, especially in the U.S., we have a large number of retail uninitiated investors. It's not simply an institutional-based market or institutional-based market. What we have is a large number of individual retail investors who are uninitiated. And these individuals, especially if they do not have advanced degrees and so on, they justifiably believe that these directors and officers are fiduciaries, that they ought to be held accountable if they don't act up to the standards to which fiduciaries ordinarily or traditionally have been subject to, and that in fact they are not held to these standards, so that this may disillusion the uninitiated investors, may cause them to lose confidence in the integrity of the securities markets, and may present them with the impression that these individuals are receiving special treatment. I'm not suggesting here that these retail investors would desert the public markets. After all, their main concern is investing in the markets and hopefully making a good amount of money. But nonetheless, it is a cause for disillusionment and presents a false portrayal. And we go back to the first point I made, and that is that a fundamental principle of the rule of law is that it should be truthful. Mm-hmm. And in this situation, it's not truthful, so that another term should be developed. And I believe that a neutral term, I'm not suggesting anything pejorative or that is unsuitable here, and that is a neutral term. And the term I've come up with is the term discretionaries, and which means that these individuals have specified responsibilities and they're held accountable depending upon the facts and circumstances of the underlying situation.
So what does this mean in practical terms? How would you suggest, does this change how we think about directors and their responsibilities?
Well, it should change tremendously, that these individuals are not necessarily held to standards to which fiduciaries are held. So when one looks at the obligations of directors and officers, that they're held to far more lax standards, and that one should invest his or her finances, funds, and so on with that recognition. Now, I might note here that the courts in the U.S. distinguish between standards of conduct and standards of review, which are also called standards of liability. The standards of conduct basically are very lofty standards and frequently are fiduciary in nature. However, standards of conduct are best practices. Mm-hmm. They are what directors and officers should aspire to. They are hortatory in nature. They are not legally obligated to be complied with. When you look at the liability standards, those are far more lax. And those are the factors that really cause meaning. Now, there's another factor in here as well, and that is, of course, company law is not the only criterion that is at issue here with respect to director and officer conduct. After all, we have the input, the pressures put on by investors,
exactly,
who desire law-compliant behavior. After all, their capital is at risk here. We also have the impact of other statutes in the U.S., such as a company that is in the food and beverage industry. Then you have the healthcare statutes, a company that's in the pharmaceutical business. You have the federal drug statutes that apply. That these are U.S. federal statutes that may well subject the company to very substantial liability if the company is not compliant, and may even result in director or officer liability. So you have these other statutes being applicable as well that help induce directors and officers to comply with best practices, namely standards of conduct, because these do have some impact on standards of liability outside of the company law area.
Now, we have a lot of international listeners, and of course, a lot of the companies they represent also do business in the US, or they look towards the US for good practice. What do you think some of our international listeners should take away from this discussion we currently have?
Well, they can take away a good number of issues. One is, of course, the law is becoming far more lax in the United States under company law and U.S. securities law, not only by way of these state statutes, but under the current federal administration, under the Trump administration. The SEC has been downsized. Its enforcement division is not nearly as active as it was in the last few years. So the likelihood of actual liability is lessened. However, things change. And it's only a matter of time, of course, when a more regulatory administration will be in place. And then the question is the states. And that is, are we going to have a situation in the United States, as we had with the Enron situation, that these laws have become so lax that there's going to be noncompliance. And if there's widespread noncompliance with no repercussions, it's only a matter of time before financial frauds occur. And the history has been, when that does occur, then the U.S. Congress steps in and adopts legislation that is very intrusive, which is going to the increasing evolution of the federalization of corporate governance by the federal government, taking away the parameters of state oversight. So we have all those possibilities. But again, the other point is that outside of company law, we do have other statutes, regulations applying, as well, of course, the very active voice of institutional and other active shareholders who view it as very important to have law-compliant practices. Otherwise, simply, they will sell their stock, they will cause discord, they may mount a proxy fight, and it will result to the detriment of incumbent management as well as the board of directors that's currently in place. So that standards of conduct should be adhered to. They're best practices, no question about it. And most publicly held corporations that are good size and that have the foundational structure seek to adhere to those. But the fact remains that under U.S. company law, the failure to adhere to these practices and failure to adhere to fiduciary standards will likely have very little repercussions under state company law insofar as director and officer monetary liability is concerned. So those are the various issues at play here.
Thank you for spelling it out, Mark. I mean, I look at the time, I think it's a very thought-provoking issues for investors as well as directors alike, that we have to come to an end. What should our listeners, and keep in mind that it's a global audience, what should our listeners really take away from this podcast episode?
The forecast is, as I pointed out, that best practices are to be followed. However, if best practices are not followed in the United States, the standards have become so relaxed insofar as liability under state company law, and for that matter, under the federal securities laws as well, that the likelihood of actually being saddled with liability, monetary liability, that has been substantially diminished in the last decade. To the degree, as I posit, that these individuals no longer should be deemed to be fiduciaries, a neutral term should be used that accurately describes their status, and that is their discretionaries.
Mark, very interesting. Thank you so much for taking the time and contribute to the Better Boards podcast series. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Better Boards podcast series. If you would like to hear more about our work, if you are interested in contributing to the Better Boards podcast series, get in touch. We are always delighted to hear from you. You can best reach us at info@better-boards.com. Thank you for listening.